Events like today are essential to bring together all those players that will have an effect on our cities, on our populations into the future. The opportunity to meet people almost by accident in the corridors, over lunch, over morning tea, is equally important because it gives us the chance to broaden our horizons and understand our neighbourhood, our region, much more deeply and much more meaningfully.
The workshop was really interesting because we were able to draw on the different voices all across the globe on the common issues that we face, and just talking from different perspectives, finding those common values and principles that we find that we need to join forces together.
Our future wellbeing is based on understanding the places and the people that we serve, both as professionals, as researchers, as academics. Without having that impact on those communities, we don't have a future.
G'day and good afternoon. I'm Bruce Watson, Pro Vice-Chancellor Inclusion at the University of New South Wales. UNSW was established in 1949 in the state of New South Wales, Australia. We aren't in the UK. It was established shortly after World War II, and it was established with a founding mission to help address the critical skills deficits for the betterment of a post-war society. So stepping up in an emergency is something that we're well equipped to do and is part of our DNA. Today we are a contemporary, energetic public university, strongly connected to the public purpose of engaging and contributing to positive societal impact, locally and particularly across our growing partnership in the Asia-Pacific region and further afield across the globe. UNSW's motto, which sat in the crest, which is a tiny crest up here and you can't see, originally started with knowledge by hand and mind, and reflected our commitment to practical application of knowledge through research, learning and teaching. In 2021, we made a small but very important change to that motto, which isn't something that universities do very often. So to the hand and mind, we added by knowledge by heart, hand and mind. So the inclusion of heart signified our conscious commitment to equity, inclusion and progress for all. At just 75 years young, UNSW is deeply committed to fostering a sustainable, equitable and just future through positive societal impact. We recognise that our endeavours at UNSW take part on the lands, waters and under the wide skies of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who have been learning, teaching, making and building community on the lands of our university for over 60,000 years. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and all Indigenous peoples to the workshop. It's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this workshop focused on the potential of great cities, which I'm sure is close to all our hearts. So thank you. I'll now hand over to Professor Peter Poulet, who will lead you through the overview of the workshop.
Thank you very much, Bruce. The Cities Institute is heavily invested in our urban future. I am the director of the Cities Institute at the University of New South Wales, and our cities, our region, needs to succeed and nurture and nourish our populations. The last urban migration is happening here and now. Our region is the fastest growing, with 17 megacities, some highly advanced and prosperous, and others with significant migration pressures from rural and remote populations, driven by a number of factors, from climate change to economic opportunity. And opportunity and inequality are seen in equal measure across our cities. So today, we will present you with some of the emblematic themes we at the University of New South Wales have been working on. The first segment of the workshop is designed to present to you themes intended to provoke you to reflect on your situation and then to expand by critically reflecting on our work to help us sharpen our understanding of what matters and potentially signal new directions and themes. So the second segment is when I'm asking you to really work with us. The second segment of our workshop is intended to be expansive, to encompass your experiences and to bring to the surface your most pressing issues when it comes to the evolution and change encountered in your cities, settlements and towns. And today's workshop critiques the provocations being presented by the panellists here by really two themes. Firstly, how do we measure and understand the issues and matters that we are seeing or hearing, and are we seeing and hearing all of them? And secondly, how does our past and our understanding of the place that we inhabit govern our future? So importantly, interwoven across the presentations and the interactive workshop will be a focus on those two intersecting themes: appropriate indications of change with an overlay of our history and connection to country. How can this shape us and our places into the future? And I'd like to think that today is really only the start of a collective conversation that we would like to continue in the future with you all. So welcome again, and may I in the first instance introduce Melissa, please.
Thank you. So my name is Melissa Edwards and I'm the Research and Innovation Director at the Centre for Social Impact. I've been open to invite the provocations on metrics that matter in a matter of 3 minutes. How we see the world matters. Our place on the planet matters. Together we've developed sophisticated techniques to gather data across the planet and used our collective intelligence to create metrics that track trends over time. Statistical methods compute these data points through indicators to inform our relative progress against benchmarks and standards. And just as we have here at this conference, we can effectively rank ourselves to aim and aspire for what good looks like. Thanks to sustainability and ESG metrics, organisational decision makers can now effectively create resource flows, finance decisions across entire global value chains to prioritise sustainability and resilience factors. While the recent proliferation of these sustainability metrics has caused some confusion, the alphabet soup as it's known, about what is most material, we are seeing these measures integrated into the core market mechanisms to value what matters. Yet despite such intelligence, our impact on climate and one another worsens. Do these sophisticated data systems, the way we see the world, actually separate us from and distract us from our focus? What holds us back? How are we using data, statistics, information? Should we measure, in fact, barriers to sustainable development and progress? And not what, but how we make a meaningful difference. Since the global vision of our common future in 1987, substantial global efforts have sought to achieve economics with a human face. Comprehensive global SDG frameworks guide our efforts together, and there are over 30 metrics of wellbeing and quality of life currently in use by international agencies across the world. Although gaps in these metrics have been identified, and it is acknowledged that we need to explore composite measures or nexus between different indicators, we are actually making progress on measuring what matters. Yet what matters is not progressing in our human endeavours. And what matters in the world today is substantially different from that time and place when these goals were established, changed by us. The worsening climate, biodiversity loss, intensified migration, social dislocation and heightened political instability. We need to put at the heart of what matters our capacity to act on these intractable issues that pervade us and that keep us separated through data, metrics, and dashboards. Metrics must be dynamic, account for complexity, alternate scenarios of the future, feedback loops, and they must be guided by foresight in the now. At the centre where I work, the Centre for Social Impact, we've implemented social impact techniques for over 15 years. These methods are designed to survey and assess programs through meaningful indicators to help us understand impacts on the ground in the lives of people, to improve how we design strategies and programs to enable social innovation and sustainable development. We've come to understand through this time that who designs the program, for whom and for what purpose, and their assumptions of change ultimately determine the outcomes. But also, and too seldom, we understand that the unseen and unheard lived experiences of people, their wisdoms, cultures, traditions, and stories of change, and their needs and everyday activities are the outcomes that are important and significant. To move forward, we want to take time together today to expand our collective imagination. We invite you here to surface your own assumptions about change, about sustainability, provoke the heart, our mind and our state of being to be really present in the room here today. To put metrics behind us and to really start to account for the deep histories, Indigenous wisdom and intergenerationality, the conditions of our mind, the architectures that contain our choices and our behavioural responses, the narratives of our place on this planet and the dynamic nexus of planning factors that generate our urban infrastructures, the patterns of life and well-beings in the cities where we live. And as Peter opened, we're going to hear 5 emblematic issues from my colleagues here on the panel today that we are grappling with in this region and in the place where we come from, being Sydney, Australia. Michael Rose will begin.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Melissa. I'm Michael Rose. I'm the chair of the Committee for Sydney, which is an urban policy think tank based in Sydney, and we work with our members and our collaborators, and our collaborators include UNSW and, in particular, the Cities Institute at UNSW. We work with them to research, think about, and advocate in relation to significant policy issues for our city. Sydney is a prosperous city in a prosperous, highly urbanised nation, and so it doesn't necessarily share all of the issues that cities around the world have, but we have quite a few issues which are common issues to other cities in our region, and I wanted to talk about just a few of them today, and to talk about how Sydney's history of migration is relevant to the way in which those issues are presenting themselves. As you heard Bruce say a bit earlier, Sydney has a history of about 60,000 years of human occupation, probably more than 60,000 years. But the city of Sydney, the modern city of Sydney, is really just 230 years old. And that 230 years includes about 130 years of British colonisation, which is where we got our laws and our institutions and our planning system. And it's also included a constant stream of immigration. For a lot of that time, the immigration came from the British Isles, but increasingly during the 20th century, immigration came from all over the world. And since the Second World War, it has been very dramatic in how broad it has been. This map you can see here shows where the number one source of people in different local government areas of Sydney. Now, the blue is people who come from the British Isles. Now, what that is reflecting is more than 100 years of immigration from those places. If you strip out the British Isles, though, you get this. The red is China, massive immigration from China, particularly over the last 30 years, although there are Chinese communities in Australia that have been in Australia for 150 years now. If you look at the green section in the centre of the map, that is India, and there's a section sweeping down to the south and the west of Sydney Harbour where you can see big groups from Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Vietnam, a big sweep of people from Greece and Italy, for example. So massive migration to Sydney. 49% of the people who live in Sydney are migrants or the children of migrants. That is a higher proportion than almost any city in the world, including the famous sort of migration cities like New York and Los Angeles, for example. Toronto, Vancouver, Auckland and Sydney have these numbers, which is pretty significant. In recent years, most of the new migration to Sydney has gone to the west and the southwest of the city. That map, incidentally, is 70 kilometres from east to west and 70 kilometres from north to south. The migrants have gone to the south and the west, and unfortunately, as the city has expanded out there, low-density urban sprawl, infrastructure investment didn't keep up, and as a result, people who live in the south and west of Sydney have less access to the critical infrastructure that they need for their lives. Less access to schools, less access to hospitals, less access to universities, less access to high-quality jobs. And so as a result, Sydney has developed over time a significant degree of spatial diversity, spatial inequality. And that's quite new for Australia. Australia has been a country that has had pretty strong social mobility, fairly low social inequality by global standards, but that is now emerging in Sydney and is emerging in a way which is starting to be very noticeable. These are just a few maps which you might not be able to read from where you are. And what you can see is people in the south and the west, because there's no investment in mass transit, they are spending more on transport than people who live in the eastern half of the city. Because there's been inadequate investment in good quality housing, they spend more on energy than people who live elsewhere. They spend more on rent than people who live elsewhere. And you can see there are some people here who are spending 70% of their income on transport and rent. And that is, significantly now beginning to be an issue for our city. During COVID, everybody woke up to the fact that most manual jobs in Sydney were done by people who live in these dark blue areas, who had very little choice about how they would manage their lives during the pandemic. If you overlay that with some demographic data, there's another example here on the left of chronic disease. You see that chronic disease is significantly worse in the western half of our city than in the eastern half, which is strange because the youngest people live in the western half. So you have a rich, educated, ageing population in the eastern half of the city and a less rich and more disadvantaged on nearly any measure you choose. You could choose any measure and you're going to get maps that look like these. And so not only does inequality have a spatial dimension, but it has a demographic dimension, an intergenerational dimension, that we have a generation growing up in the west of the city who don't have the opportunities that others have. And so that is one of the things that is really now beginning to occupy people's minds in Sydney, this intergenerational equity issue and the spatial equity issue. There's been very, very significant investment in infrastructure in Sydney, schools, hospitals, new metro systems, new road systems, but these will take a long time to start to deliver more equal outcomes to the other side of the city. Part of the thinking, though, around how to make the city a more equitable place is beginning more and more now to draw on communities that have come from elsewhere. And the most recent migrants to Sydney have maintained connections with the countries they've come from, and they bring with them cultural habits which are quite different to the cultural habits that have informed Sydney's planning up to now. Much greater degree of intergenerational thinking, a much greater degree of social cohesion, we think, in those communities. And also Sydney started to listen a lot more to or to try to listen a lot more to its First Nations people who have a long-standing understanding of the environment, long-standing understanding of intergenerational responsibility for each other and for the environment. So these are positive signs. I'm getting the wrap up, so let me leave you with a couple of questions. First, when thinking about climate change and responses to climate change, when thinking about inequality in cities, what do you prioritise? The urgent, the politically expedient, the long-term, or the near-term problems? Second question from me is, who gets a voice and how? How do you hear from First Nations people? How do you hear from the established communities, which have always had a political voice? How do you hear from new arrivals? How do you hear from younger people who are often not consulted? And how do you hear from people who don't yet live in your city because they haven't been born yet or they haven't arrived yet? How do you plan ahead for them? So they're my questions, and I'm sorry for going over time. And now I'm going to introduce you to Samantha Rich. Samantha.
Yeradu Marang Nyani, Baladu Wiradjuri Yamadu Samantha. So I'm a Wiradjuri woman with cultural connections to the Galari Bila. So I speak from a cultural perspective. And ideally, I'd have my elders and community here with me, but I've tried to bring in their voices as much as possible. So our cities, spaces and places really need to connect to and care for country. Country is a term that we use in Australia to refer to our connection with place, and it's hard to define simply as it will differ from language group to individual. However, here is a definition from Shannon Foster, a local Tharawal woman and traditional knowledge holder of the Sydney region. So country is often misunderstood as being synonymous with land, but it goes far beyond that. It comprises of ecologies of plants, animals, water, sky, air, and every aspect of natural environment. Country is a spiritual entity. She is mother. She is not separate from you. All things are connected and everything is interrelated. It is a commonly held practice among many First Nations people across the world that our being, doing and thinking is intertwined and deeply rooted in place. How we see the world, self and well-being is directly connected to the place in which we originate from. And this is just a diagram that kind of articulates moving away from this egocentric to ecocentric mentality that we're trying to push. So this connection to ourself and well-being and country is articulated in research with the Yawuru community in Broome, who speak of Mabulian, which means good spirit. And they see Mabulian as being directly tied and connected to the health of country, community and culture. Healthy country means healthy people. And the values and principles that can center country lie in the 4 R's that many of our elders speak of: respect for knowledge holders and country, responsibility to care for country and community, reciprocity, which is fundamental in our culture between people, communities and country, and relationships and relationality. So how is it or isn't it translated into the design of cities and spaces? 2 examples of this, of how this could be done better, is the usage of traditional place names and valuing cultural knowledge. So an ancient river located in Wainumatta or Western Sydney, the Daruban, was renamed after the Baron of Hawkesbury, despite him never actually visiting Australia. Traditionally, every place and distinctive feature would have a name, and encoded in that name is the history, geography and cultural knowledge. These are shared understandings of country by those that live and use those areas, and they're integral to a group's understanding of their history, rights and responsibility for that place. Bernadette Hardy, a local Darug woman and designer from Sydney, articulates, just because the names are changed doesn't mean the land isn't speaking the language and the law of it. By looking into the review mirror and understanding the deep time and wisdom held in our place names, we learn from the law of the land to shape spaces that truly belong. This reflection demonstrates that listening and reflection are progress. It honours our methodologies and history, and it cultivates environments of custodianship that care for country where all feel connected, respected, valued, seen, and most importantly, a sense of belonging. Our culture is the longest living culture on earth, and we carry over 65,000 years of knowledge of the land we now call Australia. If the Australian community can acknowledge the ongoing history of its First Nations people and are humble enough to listen and value alternative knowledge systems, this will enable practitioners, policymakers and developers to design more appropriately to broaden the knowledge of that place and understand where and how to build and design which works relationally with country. An ancestral story of the Newcastle area, a town in New South Wales, tells of a history of earthquakes that occurred in the past. The local Worimi and Akabul groups warned settlers of this occurrence. Unfortunately, like many instances, they were not listened to, and in 1989, a large earthquake occurred, killing over 13 people and injuring hundreds. Many buildings were destroyed and damaged, and their bill totaled over $4 billion. If the local Aboriginal community had been listened to and their local knowledge valued, the buildings, engineering, infrastructure could have been designed and planned appropriately to avoid this type of natural event. And more recent examples are still occurring. With communities and airports being built in an area called Waianamarra, which means place of mother. It's a sacred water country, and many elders believe that these areas will flood and sink. With that, I will hand over to Tam to his provocation.
Cheers. Thanks, Samantha. And hello, good morning, everybody. My name's Tam, a Sustainable Urbanisation Specialist with the United Nations Human Settlements Program. I should also say that I'm sharing here on behalf of our Chief Sri, who unfortunately couldn't be here today because he's unwell. But thank you, Professor Edwards, for sharing that background, and Michael for that. I think perhaps I'm a product of some of that, as you shared. I was born here in Thailand. I moved to Australia when I was 2.5. To Vietnamese parents, and in the past decade, I've lived in over half of the countries in Southeast Asia. So migration is definitely real. So just allow me to share a bit of the perspective from UN Habitat here. So firstly to say, for the last 4 decades, UN Habitat has been involved in empowering communities in Afghanistan, building million houses in Aceh Nias after the tsunami and the earthquake, assisting families in the Philippines post-Yolanda and Myanmar after Nargis, and supporting 20 million homes in India under the All Homes for Housing initiative as well. Actually, we also have our former country rep for Afghanistan, Matthew, here with us as well, which is lovely to see. And just to share in what Sri would share, for all of these issues that we've been involved across the region, the most important takeaway is trust the people, right? So making themselves owners of the process and not just the beneficiaries of developmental programming, and ultimately because they know better, what needs to change. So for today's session, I understand colleagues have asked us to help share a practical sense of the challenges resulting around urban migration on the ground and provoke some debate around that moving forward. So to present a picture of the enormity of the issue, let me perhaps use the case of India as an example. This is a picture from Bhutan, but just to elaborate a bit further. So, great. So India, as you know, just over a few months ago, overtook China as the most populous country in the world. So as it stands right now, 1/6 of the world's population resides in India. And if we think by 2036, just to give some rough ballpark, there's an estimated need for $840 billion worth of infrastructure, according to the World Bank. And what that translates to is $55 billion per year, approximately 1.2% of the GDP that needs to be invested in building infrastructure. So according to estimates we have now, 70% of the built infrastructure in India by 2047 is yet to be built. So we can understand the scale of the complexity there as well, and also begs the question about whether or not the existing governance structures that we have, the on-treasury, on-delivery mechanisms that exist within government, are they fit for purpose for this scale of development that is unprecedented globally? And we're not just referring to the forced urbanization, whether it's due to climate, whether it's due to disaster, but we're looking at migration that happens organically as a result of people's independent choices to freely move within cities and within countries as well. So like urban migration, urbanization is essentially inevitable. So this slide here, what we hope to share first and foremost is that we recognize that migration is at its core driven by a demand for resources. It's of course also a result of persons aspiring and seeking opportunities for better economic livelihoods and education. And at the same time, migration is significantly influenced by market forces and new policy. Now I say new policy because urban policy without implementation is nothing merely than the political rhetoric of political governance at the time. So new policy espouses a change in the status quo. But now we ask ourselves, how many countries in the Asia and the Pacific region are ready to challenge the status quo when they cannot even begin to conceptualize the exact rate of urbanization that exists, basically fueled by vote bank politics as well? So now, another key challenge of this is that the supply of labor workers, unfortunately, is considered unending. And in many cases, corporate and many other sectors see this as being agnostic of their concerns. So the lives of migrants are expendable. So consequentially, we see that the environment is being exploited, the migrants themselves, and this becomes a persisting challenge of that area as well. So according to the ADB, welfare gains from infrastructure-led integration and development are potentially large, however. So we recognize that at least $568 billion in Southeast Asia and South Asia and Southeast Asia can be reaped, and net gains can be multifold if we are able to leverage the gains from this as well. So just development, when done right, can certainly be felt by all parts of society. So this brings me to my last slides here as well. So I'll just click through there. So although conditions have improved, when we think about the characteristic profiles of migrants, what they generally look like in the region, we often see them in the dirtiest jobs, in waste collection, in waste picking, sewer cleaning, in hazardous occupations that expose them to harmful toxic chemicals and fumes, and also in demeaning jobs where they're plying their bodies and engaging in immoral or conflicting areas of their beliefs as well. So it is a challenge, and this is the reality for the large population of migrants that exist in the region. On a more positive note, if I can close off, I did want to add 3 other Ds for our consideration today. So that is D for daring, D for diverse, and D for dauntless, because as much as there needs to be continued focus on the urban population, the areas here, ultimately, migrants are a result of great adversity that shaped them dynamically into who they are today. So can we imagine a Singapore that would exist without the migrant workers that have supported them, and thriving economies, and also the contributions that they bring back to their own households and those that their loved ones in the countries of their residence? Can we think of Bangkok, where we are here today, without the services rendered by migrant workers from neighboring countries as well? So I hope to hear some of the answers from yourselves throughout the course of today. And finally, just a quick plug, warmly welcoming you all to the World Urban Forum coming up in Cairo in November. We're expecting 13,000 to 19,000 people. We hope we can continue the discussion here today and also there as well. With that, I'll hand over to Jin Hee. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jin Hee Kim. I'm a scientia academic at the UNSW Cities Institute, and my research focuses on transdisciplinary urban policymaking for urban health. The provocation that I want to raise today is on who is responsible for ensuring the well-being of cities. First, I want to discuss the concept of city well-being. So city well-being is not merely the sum of the health of its inhabitants. It's about the overall functionality of the urban ecosystem. So a healthy urban ecosystem is one that is vibrant, that is resilient, sustainable, and equitable. And we need to make this distinction between the health of the humans and the health of the environment. At the end of the day, human well-being is contingent on the health of the urban ecosystem. Now let me bring your attention to the Asia-Pacific region. And in thinking about city well-being in this region, there are 3 characteristics that we need to consider. First is the rapid speed of transformation. Second is extensive scale. And thirdly, the diversity of urban contexts. So first, speed. What took Latin America over 2 centuries to transition from 10% to 50% urbanization, it took less than half of that, only 90 years in the Asia Pacific. In some countries such as South Korea, where I grew up, it took less than 60 years, that's less than one person's lifetime, to reach 90% urbanization. This means that there is an entire generation of people who were born in villages, moved to cities, and will die in cities. Second, scale. So there are 17 megacities in this region. This is over half of all global megacities. It is also reported that there are 2.5 billion people living in urban areas in the Asian Pacific region. This means roughly 1 out of 3 people in the world live in a city in the Asia Pacific. And thirdly, diversity. The range of urbanization patterns is widely diverse, from these rapidly growing megacities to urbanization in small island contexts. Now, given this background, how healthy are the cities in the Asia Pacific? Are we creating vibrant, resilient, sustainable, and equitable urban ecosystems? And how are the cities impacting the physical, mental, social, cultural, and spiritual well-being of its residents? We know very well that a car-dependent city harms the sustainability and well-being of the urban system and its residents. Urbanization patterns have also shaped and disrupted our social and cultural traditions. Most societies, as they continue to move to urbanization, experience drastic changes to their social and cultural contexts. And these impacts are further pressured by population aging, digital transformation, and the climate crisis. We often say that these are wicked or complex issues, and they certainly are. But these complex issues cannot be addressed through a collection of isolated solutions or with a complicated or reductionist lens. We cannot assume that the parts will form the whole. And what we need is a transdisciplinary leadership that places the well-being of the urban ecosystem at its core value. And unfortunately, this still sounds more like an ideal than reality. So hence my provocation. Who is responsible for ensuring city well-being? Is there any existing institutional governance structure in the Asia Pacific? There are some actors in this region, such as the Healthy Cities Network or the World Health Organization, who are making efforts to put health and well-being on the highest agenda of urban policies. However, these are traditional health sectors, and they can only address the downstream impacts of urbanization. In other words, these public health-focused institutions do not have the ability to address the structural upstream factors that determine the health and well-being outcomes of our urban ecosystems. Then, who has the institutional power in the Asia Pacific and the expertise to bring together these actors to aspire for city well-being? Should regional intergovernmental leaders such as APEC or ASEAN show stronger leadership for city well-being? For instance, the OECD is doing what the OECD is doing through their Better Life Index and well-being indicators. Academic institutions could also play a critical role in fostering transdisciplinary action for city well-being, as our university is doing through the collaborative efforts. So in closing, from a city well-being perspective, we cannot ensure human health without a healthy urban ecosystem. Is there any regional governance structure that can support this? I now hand over to my colleague, Ben.
Thanks very much, Jinhee. My name is Ben Newell. I'm a professor of psychology and a director of the UNSW Institute of Climate Risk and Response. So I'd sit in a slightly different place to a lot of people here. I think fundamentally about the drivers of behaviour, what facilitates behaviour change, how we understand how our theories of behaviour can intersect with how we can design the places that we're going to live in and how that's going to change in the face of many climate stresses. We've been talking about metrics that matter and what we measure. Psychology is fundamentally about measurement. It's fundamentally about measuring mind and behaviour. Without that measurement, we can't assess changes in people's attitudes, their beliefs. We cannot assess changes in people's behaviour. So we need that measurement to test our theories. We need that measurement to develop and build the theories and models that can drive this behaviour change that we need. And there's a growing movement in the application of psychological theory to understanding how we're going to address the climate crisis. There's a massive now understanding, a growing awareness that everyone wants change. Countless surveys in many different countries are saying that people want things to happen. They know that the climate crisis is already here. They know that we need to change our behaviour. The question is, how do we get to the point that we want to get to in that behaviour change? How do we reach what some people talk about as social tipping points, where we reach a point in the change that precipitates the wide-scale uptake of new behaviours, new norms, new ways of living? Tipping points are often talked about in the context of other climate contexts. So, for example, the West Antarctic ice sheet. If this collapses, it can lead to massive, devastating consequences, non-linear, cascading, perpetuating effects that we can't really plan for. That's a very negative way of thinking about tipping points. But we can also think about that in a positive sense. If we can drive those social tipping points in behaviour, then we can have that same kind of non-linear, cascading, self-perpetuating change in behaviour that we want to see. So the question really that I'm raising for the provocation is, how can we achieve this change in behaviour that we want to see by designing our cities and the places that we live in ways that are going to propagate and deliver this kind of change? And just as our behaviour is affected by the physical architecture that we all inhabit, our behaviour is also affected by the choice architectures in which those choices we make are presented. So if something is already pre-selected for you on a menu, a default, you're more likely to choose that thing. You're more likely to stick with that thing. So if there's no meat on offer at lunch, then you can't choose the meat. But how far can we go with just those kinds of nudges, if you like, those simple changes in the choice architecture? Those are ways in which we can try and bring people along by acknowledging that people have individual preference, that we're not going to regulate, we're not going to force, we're not going to mandate, but we're going to encourage. We're going to try and set things up in a way that the desired behaviour is seen. But is that going to be enough? And a lot of argument, a lot of discussion, and what we've been talking about here in the changes that need to happen, some of that has to come through system level, structural level change. It has to be probably regulated, mandated. So rather than saying, well, we're going to default you into a particular sort of meat or non-meat option on a menu, we might introduce a meat tax. We might introduce regulation that encourages, forces you to make your changes different. And a lot of what goes on in behavioural science, in thinking about this intersection between choices and larger change, is to think about these mechanisms of tipping points. So how do we build interventions, that's what's shown on the left side of the slide, how do we build interventions into a community that gets from that ball on the top left image sitting in, top right image, sorry, it's sitting in stasis, to driving enough change in the community that you start to see that shift. You start to get the ball rolling in the right direction, and we can really see the change that we desire. So the real provocation that I have is, how do we strike a balance between these individual level suggestions for behaviour change and these system level regulatory mandated changes that we want to see? How do we design our cities to make climate positive behaviours the default? Do we have to have emissions taxes? Do we have to have mandates to use public transport? Or do we, as Michael was pointing out, ensure that the accessibility to these types of options are there for everyone? If we want to get this social tipping point happening, we have to ensure it's done equitably. We have to ensure that people are in a position where they can make these changes, and that that's not going to be, only relied on by a selective or an elite part of the cities that we live in. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, everyone. We're going to invite you to talk about and respond to these provocations. But before we do, I'm just going to run along the panel here and ask them to talk about and respond to some of them. Melissa, I'm going to start with you. What did you hear that was new to you? What strikes you as something worthy of responding to?
Thank you. So many things. And I think one of the key echoes I hear in this conference today is about data. So I said in my provocation, we should put the metrics behind us. But that doesn't mean we have to lose sight of the data. And I think there's been lots of provocations in the panel that make me think differently about how we use data and for what reason, for what means and for what ends. But to empower people as well to be able to understand how to use that data, the stories, the narrative, what is important to them. That I really like this idea that people, we are all people, we're not beneficiaries of some product that's framing us. And so we need to come together in order to make sense of the well-being of our cities and the places and the deep histories, the traditions and the new patterns that we're seeing forming in these places. Because the decisions that we make today are going to set the trajectory for future generations, and particularly when we're thinking about that intergenerational equity issue. Cities are urban infrastructure that doesn't really move easily. So how can we have those critical conversations today so that, and particularly in this region, so that the other focus that's come through in this discussion today is the intensity of the situation in this region where we have mega cities in great proportion. So these conversations now are perhaps more critical. They can't be left until the end of the decade, until 2030, when we get to this presumed state of progress on a set of indicators that we developed, a decade ago. That's what's striking me.
Thanks, Melissa. Samantha, what would you like to respond to?
I really kind of aligned with what Tam said about community having the solutions. So much of my work is about kind of being driven exactly by the issues that or challenges that they're facing, and listening to kind of what they think are the solutions, and trying to find information and other examples that will help them solve those problems that they're facing on a day-to-day basis. And I think it ensures that the work that you're doing is grounded in actual kind of experience. So I really like that. And I think, we have a saying in Australia, is like nothing about us without us. And I think, it applies to First Nations communities, but any kind of community that's facing any issues. It's like, don't make policy without them, without speaking with them, without, collaborating, genuine collaboration, and being led by them. And then really kind of interested in what Ben was saying about system levels, because I feel like, at least from from my experience, is that sometimes the systems get in the way of really good work, of grassroots people and organisations. And so having systems in place that facilitate and support their work to make it easier and also translatable in other places, so that we're like, okay, this works really well and this community is interested in it as well, it's easier to kind of keep working in that way. And unfortunately, a lot of the structures that are created at the moment within the Australian context are barriers rather than facilitators. So I think those are the main things from me.
Thanks, Sam. Dan, I'm not going to ask you an open question that lets you roll on. I'm going to frame a question for you. Jinhee talked about the importance of resilience generally and social resilience. She touched on. You made the point about how migrant communities are often made up of very resilient people who have left their home context. But you also made the point that they're very often people who are separated from a lot of the things that provided social cohesion in their own communities that they left. So this balance between social cohesion and the need for social cohesion in the new place, the resilience of migrants, but sometimes perhaps the loss of the connectivity that was the source of their original cohesion. How do you think about those things in your work?
Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. I mean, I've been through it myself, right? I mean, I think as we've seen with the Vietnamese community in Australia and Sydney there, and many other migrant communities, it often comes in waves, right? And it's a period of change, a flux, and second generations trying to maintain language and connection with culture and history as well, which is slowly fading away. So I think. I think ultimately that social resilience is built from an inherent appreciation of that background and what they've come through for that adversity, listening to stories from parents and others about what has come before, and then ultimately integrating that into what society is helping to mold them through, stronger educational pathways and programming. So I think it really does have to be a fusion of both, but it would be a terrible loss to lose, what's been their core, right? And I think what makes many countries like Australia diverse and multicultural. So I think that's what probably I would reflect upon. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Well, thank you. When Jinhee was talking about vibrancy being the critical factor, I was thinking about our city and how vibrant it is because of the experience that people like your parents have brought to it. Ben, I'm going to throw it to you, and then I'm going to come back to Jinhee. Last thoughts from you?
I think it's been a very interesting discussion just to reflect on the different perspectives that are brought here. I was drawn to Tam's point about trusting as well, trusting people, and how do you develop that trust, and how do you actually then build up the types of behaviours or get an understanding of the types of behaviours that people are willing to change and understand their understanding of the problems that we're facing. So I think that interactivity is fundamental.
Thank you. Jinhee, in 1.5 minutes, your time starts now.
Yeah, what jumped out to me was, just listening to all the panels. In public health, we have this framework of the social determinants of health. So what causes disease and illness and what produces health is actually, again, I briefly touched on it in my talk, but who decides, who has the power over deciding what happens there, and who does that impact? I think there's a huge disjoint there. So, and when we talk about, the system, maybe the system isn't broken, it's working, but it's working for the people who have, power over the social determinants of health, but not for the people who are impacted by that. And I think that's what, we all can agree on, the community having the power.
Well, great. Thank you very much. Now, hopefully, some of those reflections from the people up here on the stage will provide a starting point for your discussions now.
Bulavinaka, everybody. May I please have your attention? Thank you very much. Time's up, eh? So my name is Salate, and I'm from the University of the South Pacific. My friend is?
I'm Jimmy Healy. I'm from the University of New South Wales and also from the Solomon Islands government.
Yes. So if you're asking why the Pacific Islanders are representing table 5, ask the 3 men with a white man with a beard on our table. Yes. So it's only a joke. If you want to know more, ask them. So we have 7 points that we have discussed on our table. First of all is human rights. Human rights needs to be the guarantor of the just transition of this urban migration. Access to affordable social services, clean water, affordable health services, land disputes, which we mainly experience in the Pacific, land disputes of the informal settlements that I am one of the informal settlers, yeah? So I'm speaking from experience and some of us on the table as well. So the trust, the important component of this transition is trust and collaboration with the local communities, and underwritten by accountability, transparency, you name it. It's in that point. So in Taiwan, I'm sure that my friend from Taiwan has a vast explanation, and if you want to know more about this point, please ask her, because I was not focusing when she was sharing this point, and I was volunteered to present on that table. Yeah. So the next one is the attitudes towards migration, domestic politics, and international on this urban migration. And lastly, focus on other cities than just the major cities. Maybe if we focus on building infrastructure, we wouldn't have clusters into just one major cities and having expanding population sizes and risking a lot of help white men with a beard. Yeah, a lot of these social issues that we are raising that we have currently, and our brilliant speakers have heavily emphasized to us this morning. If you have any more questions, please ask them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was great. That's thanks, Table 5.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Charlotte, and this is Anil, and we're both the students from UNSW who won the competition to be able to be here. So I think our table ended up focusing a lot on ideological perspectives and how culture and background can influence how we view our cities and also what we want out of our cities. So I guess in the context of Sydney, it's very relevant, the topic of urban sprawl, especially out into Western Sydney, and how we do need densification and infill in the Eastern Harbour City and what's already built up, and achieving affordable housing. But there's a challenge that I guess a lot of Australians and Americans want the big house with the backyard. So how do we, I guess, find the balance between those two? We talked a lot about individualism versus the collective, misinformation, a fear of change, and institutional bias, and also sort of the challenge between academic knowledge versus really listening to the community and what they want, and sort of putting more value on the communal perspective, which I think Samantha Ridge also talked a lot about. So, yeah.
Table 4.
Hi, my name is Sibora. I'm summarizing a few of the insights from Table 4. We spoke a lot about how we conceptualize urban environments, and actually how we conceptualize the divide between what is urban and what is rainforest, what is local, and how one of the insights, for example, is that how we conceptualize these divisions actually sometimes lead us to think that they have conflicting interests. But increasingly, in different parts of the world, we are finding out that they are interrelated. Not to say that one is more valuable than the other, but that agendas like the water agenda, for example, or other interesting, vital issues in urban areas are increasingly recognized as dependent on globally relevant landscapes, such as rainforests, or livelihood and food sustainability is dependent on local communities. So this is all related, and they are all equally important. So probably it's important to not conceptualize them as a conflict of interests. We also spoke of a very interesting insight was the expansion in South Korea, for example, of the accessibility and availability of services and utilities outside of key urban areas. And this makes it easier for people to de-urbanize, move out of urban areas. So super important. And leads to less consumption and less struggling for resources. A third one is the housing and construction that is not listening to cultural and local communities. Actually, a lot of times ends up being less sustainable, not only sustainable construction and building wise, but also communities are less sustainable. And we listen to the case of Brunei, where communitarian way of living is less possible now with modern construction, and that is like an example of construction not listening really to communities and being less sustainable. And we really ended up with speaking about the need to change mindsets towards more deurbanization and to decentralize and to diversify lifestyles, especially with young people maybe, so that they do not end up conflicting and struggling for limited resources, but that more and more people move out of cities.
Thank you. That's great. Table 1.
So we had a long conversation about political economy in cities and the challenges of pushing towards equalities in systems which are intrinsically capitalist, and the way in which they are trying to remake cities, erasing a lot of the collective intelligence that we would be trying to access otherwise to find the solutions. And in terms of some of the things that we were working through as effective mechanisms for measuring that, we had forensic accounting as a key discipline, the example of roadmaps of carbon emissions as a useful way of thinking through embedded stuff, and last of all, metrics around being able to understand consultation, the outcomes of, not consultation, but community engagement and public engagement processes to set priorities for research, and what are the outcomes of that research. So that's what we covered, I think, broadly. Anything else?
Thank you. Table 1. Table 2.
Thank you. Hello everyone, I'm Samantha Stanley from the UNSW Institute for Climate Risk and Response, and I've just picked a few of our top insights. So firstly, there's a lot of dashboards and data, but these questions that are left unanswered of who are we collecting data for what purpose? And we had some really interesting insights from librarians on our table who said that maybe the data isn't really interesting enough. Maybe we need to tell a story around it so it can actually connect to people, so that they can actually understand what it means and what we can do with it. We had a discussion about, does having these global goals like the SDGs actually help us achieve sustainability? And maybe they're helpful for telling a good story and for providing a shared narrative. We also talked about disparities in SES both between and within cities that are completely ignored by global metrics of success and sustainability. And we're spending a lot of money measuring things that aren't the most pressing need in local communities, so that's something that could also be addressed. Lastly, this need for global leadership, potentially informed though by local leadership.
Thank you. And the last table, table 3.
Hi, I'm Kiera. I'm from Canada. So we had a couple of very different perspectives on this, but the number one thing that we all agreed on was the need for increased global citizenry across all of our communities because they are becoming more and more diverse. An example from South Africa was the issue with no one left behind, but the idea that there's much illegal immigration that increases the complexity of not leaving anyone behind. And who bears the responsibility of that? Is it the countries that are bleeding citizens or the countries that are receiving them? In West Sydney, there was the point that community interaction needs to be both within the communities and between the communities, but it's not necessarily happening naturally, so there needs to be space that's designated for that. And then where does the identity of a community come from? And the dangers of of communities being tied to individual self-actualization, often around one identity. This can be alienating, isolating, and severely limit the changes. And the example from that was my home city of Edmonton, and we love the petrodollar and we love oil and gas, and that is not necessarily conducive to a collective identity that is sustainable. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So I'm just going to remind you one more time, if you can answer any of the questions individually between now and when we finish, that would be great. And then I'm going to invite George up.
My name is George. I'm with the University of New South Wales. I direct the Institute for Global Development, and I'm here with my colleagues. This is our closing few minutes, and we've invited our colleague from the UN Global Pulse Lab. He's come from Jakarta to join us and is a partner of UNSW. working together and looking at indications of change and progress in a post-SDG world. I've asked Ahmed to provide some reflections on today's provocations, as well as the discussions and the plenary remarks that we just heard. Ahmed, once you do that, you hand it back to me now.
Sure. Thank you, George. So this was very, very interesting to hear all the different panelists and the contributions from all participants. It was very also, I believe it's very timely actually to start discussing a bit more on metrics. I really valued some of the insights that we're giving, especially on how are we really capturing, like what are we really measuring? And I think that's a question that we often ask ourselves, because there are so many, as mentioned also by colleagues on the panel, there are so many groups who are trying to apply metrics to look at different aspects of quality of life. I think to many countries, the issue of equity within one country is a big challenge that is often missed and not captured by many of the SDGs reports and indicators that are done either on voluntary basis or regularly. And that is an issue that local leadership and the involvement of cities and looking at potentially indicators for cities can resolve. The other thing that is quite important to also think about is what are we actually measuring and for who? And here is a point where standardizing a method for all can be a bit challenging, because what matters for a given country or a given city might be different than the other. And this is where core indicators can be looked at, but then modular or hackable indicators where you can actually opt in and out and choose different levels can be more relevant, because at the end of the day, quality is a perception. And we need to make sure that individual level perception and community level perception is also captured equally. The issue of intergenerational equity that was mentioned is very, very relevant. This is actually one of the, I would say, global topics that we are looking at right now with the upcoming Summit of the Future and the anticipated, hopefully, Pact of the Future that the SG is looking for to be developed and agreed by the different member states on this September. So we are really looking forward to see what the outcome of that document would look like. We're trying to, we are hopeful that it will really capture the aspiration and the ambitions of different generations. In the beginning, when we started talking about Summit of the Future, everyone was mostly maybe thinking that it's going to be more on the strategic foresight front of looking into the future, but I think it will capture a lot more utilizing strategic foresight, but also tangible issues that are being faced by many countries. I wanted to conclude by thanking our partners at UNSW for inviting me to take part of this workshop and this conversation. I think we have a lot of, I would say, common interests to explore in the coming phase, and I'd be happy also to link the work that is being done by UNSW with some other conversations that are happening in the region, looking at quality of life indicators that I believe can be complementary and we can create synergies there. So thank you again, and back to you, George.
Thank you, Ahmed. I would just add perhaps two reflections. One is that whether it's a rural area or an urban area, invisibility is not a technical problem, it's a political problem. And that remains a challenge regardless of where we are. I mean, there are invisible demographics in the most developed societies, but also in those that are still developing. And that seems to be a dilemma that we can't overcome by looking at the elegance of data collection or the type of data or building the capacity for data collection. And so we have to find a way around that. The other is something that Jenny conveyed about the intensity of urbanization and this region. However intense the urbanization is, it still is very varied across the regions of Asia Pacific. And we're discovering that in our work, that perhaps, especially because of the climate agenda, that the urbanization challenge in Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste, for example, is quite different than the urbanization challenge in Southeast Asia and South Asia. How we as universities can accompany those sorts of varied paces of urbanization is a real policy challenge. And when you intersect that with invisibility, mainly because the economies of these places are informal, right? The data doesn't get picked up, although it exists, because there's a political decision to leave the informal out. Let's not forget that a lot of our multilateral and other mechanisms are statist and very formal. And so when we talk about decent labor, or we talk about providing housing or health access, it's all built around the political uptake of data. So let's not forget invisibility, let's not forget informality. I love the term you used, hackable measures, did you say? So that's really nice, and that's an option. I want to come back to Ben's point on social tipping points versus climate tipping points. Now, a colleague of mine, Hemanta, who's from Nepal, he and I have worked together for 25, 30 years, and we've been part of a movement in Nepal to return forests to communities. And this whole question of how do communities matter? How do we account for them in conversations around climate change? So, instead of reducing, in my view, to technical problems of 1.5, what about all the communities that are left out of even that conversation? And so how do we tip towards social indications rather than technical indications? That I thought was important. Okay, so let me close now. We have a couple of other events going on right after this. Let me thank, number one, our visitors and guests who joined us today from the Pacific and other organizations. And let me thank our organizing group. Meg is somewhere here. Meg, thank you for helping. There's Hannah over there who's orchestrating. Peter for helping us convene, of course, and our two student colleagues who's helped us. And then, of course, the supporting cast from UNSW is here, but of course, colleagues from other universities also, thank you for participating. I guess I can close with that. Very good, thank you.